My wife Lynn and I have been together for 6 years, and we got married 11 months ago. Our time together has always been pretty normal, and she's never done anything strange or worrisome before. It's really surprising for me because this isn't like her at all. Lynn is a nice, smart, and thoughtful person. She usually doesn't do silly or scary things. She's not into horror movies, and the one time we tried to watch one together, she got too scared and couldn't finish it. She doesn't like creepy stuff or playing pranks. That's just not her thing. That's why it's so weird that she's acting differently now. I should mention that she has never had any problems with her mental health, and as far as I know, it's not something that runs in her family. In the 6 years we've been together, I haven't seen any signs of her having issues. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen making coffee because I was running late for work. I couldn't go to Dunkin' Donuts that morning for my usual coffee, so I had to make it at home. As I was walking down the hall to leave, I saw Lynn peeking at me from around the corner. All I could see were her eyes and some of her hair. The rest of her was hidden. I was so surprised that I almost spilled my coffee and even burned my lips. I told her, "Geez, Lynn, you scared me a lot." It was just so unexpected. She quickly hid, like a little kid who got caught doing something. I heard her hurry away to the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was gone. It was really strange, and not like her usual self, but it was also kind of funny that she was being more playful and less serious. I yelled that I loved her and called her a weirdo. As I closed the door behind me, I heard her laughing. Her behavior was a little weird, but it wasn't something to be really worried about. I forgot about it by lunch, and when I got home, she was back to normal. We didn't talk about it, and life continued. The next weird thing happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m., and I woke up to get a drink. I was in the kitchen holding a jug of orange juice when I felt like someone was watching me. I looked down, and there was my wife's smiling face on the other side of the kitchen counter. She was peeking at me, staring with wide eyes and grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I screamed, not because I was mad, but because I got scared. When I screamed, Lynn quickly crawled backward out of sight, her hands and feet hitting the floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't chase her or yell, I just stood there, shocked, wondering why she did that. It took me a bit longer than I want to admit, but eventually, I went back upstairs. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, looking like she was asleep. Or maybe pretending. I stood there for a while, watching her breathe to make sure she was really asleep. I thought she might jump out at me when I got into bed, but she didn't. I climbed into bed, and she didn't even move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I started to wonder if maybe I dreamt the whole thing. The next morning, I waited for her to come down for coffee. After handing her a mug and giving her a kiss on the cheek, I decided to ask her about it. "What was that about last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light so I wouldn't upset her. She frowned, shaking her head like she didn't know what I was talking about. "You were peeking at me again." "From over there," I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She looked where I was pointing and then burst out laughing. She laughed so much that I couldn't help but laugh too. "You freak me out sometimes, you know that?" I said. She giggled, put her cup on the counter, and wrapped her arms around my neck. "You freak me out all the time." "So I guess we're even," she teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it was when she grinned at me from behind the island and the sounds her hands made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly, trying to join me in my love of all things horror. I wasn't scared of her, but something felt off. I noticed her peeking at me more often. Sometimes, she'd peek from behind the couch or the living room curtains. Once, she even squeezed into her grandma's old trunk at the end of our bed. I might not have known she was in there if the trunk's old hinges didn't make noise. The lid was slightly open, and only half of her face peeked out. She had a big grin, like an excited kid. It was weird, and I didn't know what to say. I just stared. When I finally spoke, I asked her why she was doing this. She didn't answer, just closed the lid and stayed inside the trunk. I walked away feeling disturbed. I didn't get why she was doing it, but it seemed to make her happy. I hoped she'd stop the game soon. For the next 2 weeks, Lynn didn't peek at me. I thought maybe she was done with her strange prank, and I was relieved. One night, while watching a show on Netflix, I joked that I hadn't seen her peeking lately, thinking she had given up on her spy game. She looked at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered if she was joking. The next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. Was she still peeking when I wasn't looking? I felt paranoid, always checking if she was watching from around corners or behind doors. I got jumpy when I was home and couldn't see her. I felt silly and a little crazy. After a few weeks without any more strange things happening, I started to feel better. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. But a few days ago, things got much worse. Lynn went to a friend's place, and I relaxed on the couch, playing some games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m., I jumped in the shower. While washing my hair, I felt that scary feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes slowly and nearly had a heart attack. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her whole head stretching into the shower, leaving her body outside. Her long dark hair hung against the curtain, wet and dripping. Her mouth was open in a creepy grin, eyes wide and red like she hadn't blinked for a while. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move, and her smile didn't go away. Her makeup was running down her cheeks in 2 black streaks. She looked excited and completely crazy. I was really scared. We both stood there without saying anything for a while. Finally, after what felt like a long time, she slowly pulled her head back out of the shower. I saw her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backward towards the bathroom door. A second later, the bathroom door slammed shut, making the mirror rattle. I screamed again and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe some of you might think I overreacted, but I wasn't going to deal with the crazy stuff anymore. I kept telling myself that as I paced in the bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly, I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, trying to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I imagined Lynn standing on the other side, giggling at her joke. I got angry. I was really mad about feeling scared in my own house and having to hide in the bathroom for an hour. All for what? A joke? If it was a joke, it was a terrible one. What the heck, Lynn? I snapped. This is getting really annoying. I waited for her to say sorry or call me a jerk. But instead, I heard a faint moan, so quiet I wondered if I heard it at all, and then complete silence. Lynn? I called out, unable to hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response, just my own heavy breathing. I swear to God, just stop it. I yelled, hitting the door with my fist. I expected her to get mad at me since I was talking like that, something I never did before. But nothing happened, just the occasional drip from the shower. I won't lie, I was scared. Too scared to open the door and face my own wife. I waited for another 30 minutes, which feels like a really long time when you're scared. Finally, I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in my bathroom. So, I got down on my knees and looked under the door. I almost thought I'd see her face, but thankfully I didn't. I could see down the hallway to the top of the stairs, but no Lynn. I didn't know if I should feel happy about that or not. I looked for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop up over the top step, but it never did. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door, mentally getting ready to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers and was about to yank it open when I heard a sound that still makes me feel sick when I think about it. A moan, louder than before, but this time I knew exactly where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door like in slow motion and locked eyes with my wife, peeking out at me from the slight gap. Her eyes were still wide, and her mouth was hanging open in the grossest smile I'd ever seen. I didn't even scream. I was too scared for that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, body shaking with excitement, like she could barely contain herself. A short raspy moan came from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow, I got the courage to open the bathroom door and ran as fast as I could down the steps. I grabbed my keys and phone from the living room table and ran outside to my car. I could hear her loud laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting closer. I didn't even bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I should have, shivering the whole time, maybe from fear or the cold. Maybe both. I didn't even grab a coat or shoes. I was still in my boxers, and my hair was still wet. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house, about 40 minutes away, ignoring all the calls and texts I got. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called me 4 times and sent lots of texts, wondering where I went and why I left like that. I threw my phone in anger at the dashboard, furious at her calm attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially just in my boxers, but they said I could stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told him Lynn and I had a fight but didn't share the details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, leaving my wife over a prank, even if it was a weird one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up instead of being so serious all the time? I wanted her to relax and have fun, but this was definitely not what I had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing she had been in there with me the whole time made my skin crawl. She never left the bathroom at all. Instead, she slipped into the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. Just the thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me a sleeping pill, so I was able to get a little rest. My sleep was filled with terrible dreams, all of Lynn's smiling face. I woke up when the sun was starting to rise. My body felt sore from sleeping on the sofa, and I was tired. I knew I had to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say. I wouldn't go home unless she promised not to do any more creepy stuff. I just wanted my wife to be normal again. Her usual serious self never seemed so good. As I was thinking about calling her, that strange feeling hit me again. I felt like someone was watching me. I was looking at the ceiling, my heart beating fast. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling, the worse it got. My eyes moved away from the ceiling almost on their own. Her face was pressed against the window next to the couch, staring down at me with that same big smile. Drool dripped down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks on the glass. I didn't know how long she had been there, but something told me she'd been there for a while, maybe all night. I didn't bother screaming, even though I was scared. Anger was stronger than fear at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass. Lynn! Are you crazy? What's wrong with you? Just go home! I shouted. Now! She didn't move, and her creepy smile didn't change. If anything, it got bigger, like she had never been happier. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs. As if Lynn could hear them from outside, her head twitched a bit in their direction, and she slowly closed her mouth. Chris called my name from upstairs, looking worried. I turned to see him and his wife Rebecca coming down the steps in a hurry. When I looked back at the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she was there was the 2 drool streaks still on the glass. I tried telling Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window. They didn't really believe me, and who would? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window, but there were no footprints in the dirt, just a small dent. Probably an animal, Chris guessed, and I didn't argue. They thought I dreamt the whole thing, but they didn't get it, and I was too tired to explain. I called out of work that day and turned off my phone. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at that point. I really started to think something was seriously wrong with her. No matter what promises she made, we might never be the same again. It made me really sad. I cried most of the morning. By noon, I thought I was ready to talk to her. Give her one last chance to explain. After 6 years, I told myself I could at least do that. I turned my phone on and saw dozens of texts from her, all seeming worried. Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home. And more of the same. All texts saying she loved me and wanted me home. How worried she was. Not one addressed the crazy things she did. It's like she hadn't been acting normal. Even her texts were different. She usually wrote long messages even for simple things, like asking me to buy bread. You'd think she'd have more to say after her weird actions. I know it might seem silly to some who are far from this situation. But if you saw the way Lynn looked at me, how she crawled away on all fours like a wild animal, grinning like a crazy person from inside the closet, then I think you'd understand why I reacted like this. I stayed with Chris and Rebecca for another night. Yesterday, I didn't wake up until afternoon, and thankfully, I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry, because it's not my place. But is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca asked. She made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to talk about it without being too nosy. I don't know. She's like a different person, I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know everything about the crazy stuff I had been dealing with. People change, Ben. But she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed, she said, trying to make peace. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her, I said. The words hurt my heart. I missed and loved my wife, but how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear didn't sound too good. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed, she said. I don't know about that, I said. Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know, Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to sink in, and when they did, I felt dread crawling through my skin. Wait. What do you mean? You saw her? You saw Lynn? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually, as if that fact wasn't scary. Maybe for her, it wasn't. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work, she said, cleaning the plates from the table. I didn't see her car, though. Maybe she took an Uber or something. Beck, what did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, feeling sweat on my forehead. I started looking around, checking corners like a predator might be hiding. No, she didn't. She just asked if you were awake, and I said you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no. Just said to let you sleep, she said while washing the dishes. That's all? She didn't say anything else? I asked. No. She looked awful, though. Like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her." I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little better knowing she hadn't come inside, but I still needed to double-check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt like I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. Didn't I swear an oath to love and honor her through sickness and health? Clearly, she was very sick. If she was sick, and I truly believed she was, I had to try and get her the help she needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police, and besides, what the heck was I going to tell them? That my wife was peeking at me? That she was being creepy? As strange as she'd been, she still hadn't committed any crime. Not yet, anyway. The police would probably say I was overreacting. But this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong. Dangerous even. Like something sinister lurked beneath her smile. I knew I could have Lynn committed as her husband, but what if she acted normal around the doctors? They might release her after 72 hours if they didn't find her a danger. I felt lost and overwhelmed, so I did what any husband would do. I called her mother. I didn't want to, believe me. Her mother, Marianne, and I were never on the best terms. We never fought, but she wasn't warm and not easy to get along with. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin smile, leaving her eyes blank. She felt like she was always defensive. I had only met her twice, and both visits were short. I felt like she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always rushed us out, not wanting me to feel uncomfortable, which I appreciated. Being with her mother felt unbearable, like walking on glass. I was glad when we moved 3 states away so we didn't see her often. I didn't want to talk to her, but I needed her help. I really didn't want to talk to her, but I had to speak to someone who knew Lynn better than I did. So, I grit my teeth and did what I had to. "Yes?" She answered, already sounding irritated. "Marianne, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to talk?" I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation. "I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment." "What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin?" she said, coolly. "It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something." I was quickly interrupted. "It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling, Benjamin." "What is it that you want from me?" she asked. I could almost see her standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on the table. "I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior? Or possibly any mental health issues?" I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause that I couldn't tell was because she was just thinking, or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke. "I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find the humor in it. Now, I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind," she said, but I cut her off before she could get rid of me. "Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behavior has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured as her mother, you would be as well," I said, my frustration evident in my voice. "If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the health professionals involved." "I don't know what you expect of me," she snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason, I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling that she knew a lot more than she was letting on. "Please. If not for me, do it for Lynn," I tried. I heard a faint shaky intake of breath, as if she were trying to hold her steely persona together but failing. "Marianne? What's WR?" I started. "Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye." I tried to call out to her, but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she want to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation, desperate to find something I missed. After a while, I almost gave up until I remembered her last words to me. "Seek professional help." She'd said those words with a bit of urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no, I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she'd said that. As if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she'd been referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was referring to someone else. Someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to go into it yet, but I told them about our last encounter. How she'd hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird, maybe, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Maybe for YouTube? Rebecca offered, if only half-heartedly. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly, was the best recourse. I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into that house alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach began doing somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a split second, I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Chris, however, was fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hands in his pockets like he was going on a stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up. "What do you guys use to clean the floors around here, poop?" Chris mumbled. "Shut up," I said, my eyes darting around for any signs of Lynn. The house was deadly quiet and dark despite being 10 in the morning. All the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow any sunlight inside. If I hadn't left it just 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house to be abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully checking any place that she might hide, occasionally calling her name. "Why are you looking under the couch?" Chris asked eventually. "Are we looking for your wife?" He looked at me like I was a moron. "Let's just go upstairs," I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few of the steps. I noticed that one of Lynn and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church, after saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me all at once. Chris noticed and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. "I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes, and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something?" Chris said. I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Chris took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I looked down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eyes she'd collected from small animals and wondered how she'd gotten them, shuddering at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. But, heck. Your wife's in here collecting eyeballs, Chris said, gagging. Ben, I think we should go. He called from the hall. I'm getting nauseous. All right. I grabbed my duffel and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue, and I couldn't help but gag. Who lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. I tried to tell you she needed help, I said. She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a flipping exorcist, he said. You coming or what? I can't stand the smell. His words died in his throat, and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me, and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. Geez, I whispered as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making. A sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving, to say the least. Wide eyes, and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I had to help her. Lynn, I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbed back and forth in two quick little movements as if she were nodding. Baby. I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that? I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide-open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew as large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better, and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding, I said. She bobbed her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder, and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn. You're bleeding, I said. Instinctively I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my bottom. My arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. You all right in there? Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly, and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore. And she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet and began walking backward down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. "Are you bleeding?" Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed, the glass shard still in her fist. "Chris. Run. Go!" I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor. "Jesus, Lynn," Chris said, "You, playing hide and seek?" I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. "Move your butt, Chris," I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp motions, and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so that her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer, and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a woman who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation. "I only want to help," I said, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her. And then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully, my body took over, and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word, I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me, still on the line with 911. I watched the rearview mirror, sure I'd see her there, running after us. But I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but of course, Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or relative for a while and to file a restraining order as soon as I could, but none of those things would matter. Somehow I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her, maybe they'd get her the help she desperately needs. But now I don't think so. Because 40 minutes ago, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words, "I found you." And a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched.